Welcome. Today we'll walk through the process of renaming an attribute within an entity whilst also maintaining database integrity. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few points. Firstly, I recommend avoiding renaming attributes whenever possible, especially if the changes need to be applied across multiple environments. Doing this would require 2 deployments to each environment that the change needs to be applied to, and we'll cover this a bit later. This is because OutSystems prioritizes database integrity. Renaming attributes in Server Studio may not work the way you expect. OutSystems will not automatically delete or move data within the database. So in the case of renaming, a new empty column would actually be created, and the data will remain in the old column and no longer visible within Server Studio. This would leave your data unavailable to be used in your applications. I also recommend installing the DB Cleaner Forge component. This tool will help clean up these invisible attributes and resolve the database integrity warnings you might see in Server Center. With this in mind, let's go over the steps involved in renaming attributes in Server Studio. Now let's say you have a configuration entity that was initially designed for Google. Later you decide to reuse this to use with other services and wish to rename the Google ID to External ID. The first thing we would do is create a new attribute called External ID. Next, we'll create a bootstrap timer that will copy all the data from Google ID into External ID. This aggregate will grab all of the account config records, where it will loop through and assign Google ID to External ID and update it. To ensure that each record is only updated once, we can add a filter here to exclude all records with Google ID empty. And we can assign Google ID empty here after we've copied the data across to External ID. This will ensure that if the timer is run a second time, the records that have already been updated will not be touched. The timer itself can be scheduled to when published, so that when it gets deployed, this data copy will happen automatically. You can now publish your module. Once your module has been published, you can track the timer in Server Center to ensure that the bootstrap has run. Once the deployment has been complete, it's a good idea to double check the database to ensure the data was copied correctly. You can do this in Server Center by checking the data here and using filters like this to check to make sure that all of the Google IDs have been emptied, and filters like this to ensure that the External ID has been populated as well. You can also use an SQL tool of your choice, where you can use statements like this, where you get the total count of your database, ensure that all Google ID has been emptied, and that all External IDs have been populated. Once you know your bootstrap is working correctly, now is the time for your first deployment if you need to apply this rename into other environments. Now's a good time to deploy DB Cleaner as well if you need to. Once deployed, the bootstrap timer will run automatically to copy the data. You should still double check the data is copied correctly by the methods we outlined earlier. Once this change has been applied to all environments and all bootstraps are run successfully, we can now finally remove the old attribute. At the same time, we can also delete the bootstrap and publish the module. Once the module has been deployed, we can now come into the DB Cleaner. Under Database Entities, we can see here the Google ID attribute that we've recently removed is still existing in the database. We can press this button here to drop it and remove it entirely. This will help us keep a nice and clean database. Once the column has been dropped, you can deploy your module into other environments and drop the columns from there as well. Following these steps will ensure that you keep a nice and clean database. So in summary, when renaming an attribute, first we create a new attribute, use a bootstrap to copy the data from the old to the new attribute, verify that this bootstrap works successfully. Then we can deploy this bootstrap to other environments if we need to. Then we can remove the old attribute, deploy that again, and then use something like DB Cleaner to clean up the hidden columns in the database. Thanks for your time and good luck coding.